Never been the board.
On this vote, the yeas are 232, the nays are 185. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. You ready?
Work on getting this. Thank you.
The chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
Mr. Speaker, request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, this week I have shared multiple accounts of testimony delivered before the Bipartisan Natural Gas Caucus during a field hearing last week in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. While I've discussed extensive job growth and revenue increases for the Commonwealth, today I rise to share benefits to property owners who have leased above the vast Marcellus natural gas play. The
House will be in order. The gentleman may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, between 2008 and 2010, landowners in 2 rural northern tier counties in Pennsylvania earned over $550 million. As of July 2013, the lifetime royalties for wells already drilled in these counties are projected to exceed $7 billion. Property values in these counties have increased to a level greater than 47% of the national average increase between 2006 and 2012 during the height of the recession. Perhaps most importantly, there are now more than ever greater prospects for future generations of Pennsylvanians. Natural gas development has allowed Pennsylvania's young workers to find high-paying, family-sustaining jobs in the Keystone State, where they can continue to live and build stronger communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California rise? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the Safe Climate Caucus to once again direct our attention to the serious threat of climate change. Republicans continue to ignore this issue and instead waste our valuable time once again attempting to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Yesterday, our Interior Appropriations markup, we ended with no real timetable for when we can finish this bill. Worse yet, and I have to just say, the funding levels in the Interior bill were absolutely irresponsible. The Republican bill would abandon our commitment to the environment, to our national parks, to the public health and safety, and most important, to climate change mitigation programs. It is sad and shameful that we are about to adjourn for a 5-week district work period, leaving critical business to create jobs, pass comprehensive immigration reform, and fight climate change. The time to act is now, and so I encourage my colleagues to begin to address this issue right away. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise? Without objection.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, during my time in the military, I had the privilege of serving as an assistant professor of American government at the United States Military Academy at West Point. And the opportunity to educate young minds about our democracy, our Constitution, our exceptional way of life was one of the greatest privileges I've ever had. The continuance of our nation relies upon the engagement of an informed citizenry. But in a time when education funding is being stretched thin at the federal, state, and local levels, civics and history are often among the first subjects to be pared down or even eliminated. I'm proud of the work of my colleagues, such as Representatives Honda and Cole, what they're doing to help promote civic education. One of my own constituents, Jonathan Estrin from Columbia County, has been helping them. I'm proud of him as well. And though it is the role of the state and local governments to establish curriculums, I support federal efforts to assist states and localities who wish to empower their students by civic education. I look forward to working with my colleagues to ensure future generations come to learn about our nation's history and remain engaged as citizens. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts rise? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, reportedly the Republican leadership has drafted a bill that doubles the level of cuts to food stamps over what was included in the Farm Bill that failed to pass this House in June. That's right, doubles the cuts. More than 50 million people are hungry in America. 17 million are kids, and the Republicans think cutting $40 billion from the most important program that prevents mass hunger in America is somehow a good thing? Give me a break. They have already tried to cut $20 billion from food stamps. They failed. Any rational person would say they went too far. We need to compromise. Instead, the Republican leadership decided to double down on the crazy. If House Republicans insist on moving forward with this awful proposal, I will fight it with every ounce of energy I can muster. We should not, we must not, we cannot allow this mean-spirited, cold-hearted proposal to pass. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from Montana rise? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this week I held a teletown hall meeting and had the opportunity to talk with several thousand Montanans about the House's efforts to bring needed accountability to Washington and lift the regulatory burdens that are hurting Montana families and job creators. Montanans are tired and frustrated by the EPA's ever-changing rules and unreasonable compliance costs. The status quo is not acceptable. That's why I'm proud to have voted in support of the RAINS Act, which will bring much-needed accountability to the regulatory process. This isn't a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. This is about doing the right thing for the American people and the future of our country. It's time to rein in Washington's overbearing, costly regulations and provide Montana families, business owners, and hard-working taxpayers with the relief they deserve. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, my colleagues, in an op-ed in the New York Times this morning, 4 former EPA administrators appeal for action on climate change, stating, and I quote, "The United States must move now on substantive steps to curb climate change," end quote. I think this House could learn a thing or two from the authors of this article. These former EPA administrators worked for 4 Republican presidents, Nixon, Reagan, George Bush, and George W. Bush. They say that, quote, "there is no longer any credible scientific debate," end quote, about climate change. And they also point out that our window for action is shrinking. They say they support the actions that the President is now taking under the Clean Air Act to reduce carbon pollution, and they call on Congress to start the overdue debate about what bigger steps are needed domestically and internationally. And they conclude with this very powerful statement. Quote, "The only uncertainty about our warming world is how bad these changes will get and how soon. What is most clear is that there is no time to waste," end quote.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to address Attorney General Holder's misinterpretation of federalism and his disregard for our system of checks and balances. The Supreme Court was clear in Shelby versus Holder that states have the ability to run fair elections. Did anybody tell Attorney General Holder? I can't say it better than Texas Governor Rick Perry, whose efforts to implement common sense election standards are under attack from Mr. Holder. Once again, the Obama administration is demonstrating utter contempt for our country's system of checks and balances, not to mention the U.S. Constitution. If Holder continues to go unchecked, and if he is not held accountable, what sort of precedent does that set? As Supreme Court Justice Brandeis said, "In a government of laws, the existence of the government will be imperiled if it fails to observe the law scrupulously. If government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for law. It invites every man to become a law unto himself. It invites anarchy." So I ask you, has the Attorney General invited anarchy? I will continue to make my case here in the People's House, at the People's Pulpit. I will be back.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
I ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I come to the House floor today to introduce my first bill as a member of Congress. It's Let the People Draw the Lines Act, or H.R. 2978. My bill does exactly what that title says. It lets people not politicians, draw the district lines for the United States House of Representatives. My bill empowers the states to create independent redistricting commissions, much like we have in my home state of California. The Let the People Draw the Lines Act will remove redistricting from the political process. It will provide clear and uniform redistricting criteria that gives all communities a fair and equal voice in the political process. This entire process will be transparent and open to the public, the way it should be. If my bill becomes law, Mr. Speaker, political gerrymandering will finally become a closed chapter in our nation's journey towards a more perfect democracy. Let the people draw the lines, Mr. Speaker. America deserves true representation. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from Mississippi rise?
Mr. Speaker, unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not a fan of government mandates, and neither are my constituents in Mississippi. But there is one mandate that the people of Mississippi sent me to Washington with, to repeal, replace, dismantle, delay, and defund Obamacare. I've heard from families, small businesses, and hardworking Americans across my district who all have the same message. This law is a train wreck. That is why one of my very first votes in Congress was to repeal Obamacare. That's why I voted to repeal it nearly 40 times over the last 3 years. That is why I introduced a constitutional amendment to restore the right of the American people to refuse this bad law. That is also why I firmly believe we must defund Obamacare in a continuing resolution this body will take up later this year. I believe this is a fight worth fighting for Mississippi, and I believe it's a fight worth fighting for the American people. I'm calling on my colleagues to join me in this fight, to stand strong, to stand together, and let's defund Obamacare. I yield.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentlelady from New Hampshire rise?
Permission to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Here we are, Friday afternoon. We have a lot of people around the country who are going home for the weekend, but expecting to go back to their workplace on Monday. But Congress is not coming back until September. Did we get everything done? No, we did not. We did manage to vote against Obamacare 40 times, and basically that means we have voted against the people of this country and their right to health insurance 40 times. But we did not cancel the sequester, which is hurting people. I delivered meals last week to a 101-year-old man who has had his meals cut because of sequester. And we didn't pass any jobs bill. Not one. Not a single jobs bill. All we have managed to do in this body is to try to take health care away from American citizens. I urge Congress to stay here. I urge the Speaker to call us back and make us do the job the American public sent us here to do. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, every year millions of Americans across the fruited plain send their tax returns to the IRS. Some claim exemptions so they can keep more of their money. Now the IRS wants an exemption of its own. IRS employees want an exemption from participating in, guess what? Obamacare. That's right, the IRS workers have asked for an exemption from Obamacare. They like their current health plan and they just want to keep it. These are the same people in charge of enforcing Obamacare and penalizing Americans that are forced to be under Obamacare. This is the same abusive, scandalous IRS that uses power to punish political opponents. The IRS taxocrats don't want the law to apply to them. They want it to apply to us. More arrogance of power. Their policy is, laws for thee, but not for me. Ironic, don't you think? The real truth, to be clear, Mr. Speaker, is the IRS wants to be exempted from Obamacare, and so do Americans. And that's just the way it is.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Request unanimous consent to address the House for a minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, sir.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to address the delicate yet much-needed balance between our national security and the constitutionally protected liberties of our citizens. In order to maintain those liberties, I call for the immediate terminations of Director of National Intelligence James Clapper and Attorney General Eric Holder. To that extent, I am sending a letter to President Obama asking that he immediately call for their terminations and/or resignations. Mr. Speaker, I do believe that our nation's surveillance programs have helped thwart terrorist attacks because of the NSA and FBI personnel that work on these security activities every day and who are working hard to comply with the law, to protect our constitutional liberties, and to keep America safe. In contrast to the efforts of those hard-working and law-abiding personnel, Americans have serious reservations about Attorney General Holder and DNI Clapper, who are ultimately responsible for the management of these programs. We remain gravely concerned about their lack of commitment to follow the law, to be forthright with the American people and with Congress, and their commitment to protect our constitutionally guaranteed liberties. Continued congressional oversight coupled with the terminations of Clapper and Holder will help restore trust in these important programs to fight terrorism without compromising our liberties or creating gaps in our intelligence structure. In addition, their removal may start the healing process to restore America's trust in our federal government. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
Consent to address the House for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the life of a brave young Ohio soldier who made the ultimate sacrifice in defense of this great country, Army Staff Sergeant Sonny C. Zimmerman. Sonny graduated from Waynesfield Goshen High School in 2005, served his first tour in Afghanistan in 2006. His fellow soldiers knew him as a leader, spoke freely of the times he helped them, stood up for them, and sacrificed for them. Chaplain Brian Frusci mentioned how Sonny always said, quote, "I have to bring my guys home," and noting that he always put himself last. Sonny Zimmerman was a decorated hero who served with courage and honor. He died on Tuesday, July 16, 2013 in Afghanistan. He's survived by his wife Morgan, daughter Riley, parents Chris and Michelle, stepfather David, 2 sisters, and other loving family. I was touched to see how many of Sonny's friends, family, and neighbors came together in his hometown of Waynesville to honor his life and sacrifice. He volunteered to serve, he loved the Army, loved his country, and he fought to promote freedom. For this, each and every American owes him and his family a debt of gratitude. Sonny Zimmerman will be deeply missed, but the strength of his character and the courage he demonstrated through his service will live on.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas rise?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Thank you. Speaker, the American people want us to work together. Could poll any one of them that are coming through these halls as tourists, as in essence Americans, and I know they want us to work together. And so I think it is important that we announce to the American people that we will immediately get rid of sequester to stop the laying off of valuable Defense Department workers and Health and Human Service workers, people who help generate the economy because of the work they do in places beyond the Beltway, government workers who are servants of the people. I think we need to get rid of sequester and begin to fund those child care seats that have been lost, those Meals on Wheels, the Medicare resources for our seniors. We need to stop playing around with the budget. We need to insist that the bills of the American people be paid through raising the debt ceiling and not in an angry manner, but recognizing our responsibilities. We know that the NSA has been looked at. I stand here as someone who will stand on behalf of the civil liberties and civil rights of Americans. I've introduced an intelligence bill to review the enormous number of contractors that are being used to give top secret credibility and as well to do our outsourcing of our work. I've introduced a bill dealing with the FISA court to release the FISA court opinions because I believe it is important for the American people to know and to be protected in their civil liberties. Finally, the Obamacare is one that I am proud to be supporting because it helps small businesses, it helps those who don't have care, and it provides for young people to have health coverage. Obamacare serves the American people. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to advise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently heard a story about one of our wounded soldiers being forced to participate in a lengthy and uncomfortable security screening at the airport. I immediately contacted the head of the TSA to express my outrage and disappointment that one of our nation's heroes would be forced to go through such an ordeal. I believe one of the most solemn responsibilities of our government is to care for our veterans and those who have been injured in the line of duty. we must remember that even little things can be cumbersome and difficult. The last thing our heroes need is to face a long line or be forced to answer endless questions about their conditions when all they want to do is board a plane and fly home to be with their loved ones. As chairman of the Transportation Security Subcommittee, I've had an active role in working with TSA, the administrator, and my colleague, Ms. Gabbard, the author of this legislation, to adopt protocols that will increase accessibility and privacy and offer less invasive screening for those who've suffered severe combat-related injuries. I urge my colleagues to agree to pass the Helping Heroes Fly Act as amended by unanimous consent today. I'm proud of this legislation because it shows an example of Republicans and Democrats working together to find solutions for the American people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, we are at a point where an unannounced, unplanned, and largely unconstitutional fourth branch of government has taken root. Dominated by unelected bureaucrats, these federal departments and agencies are churning out rules and regulations at an unprecedented pace. According to one study, federal agencies finalized nearly 3,000 rules and over 60 major regulations in 2007. That same year, Congress enacted 138 public laws. To this end, one of the first bills I co-sponsored upon being sworn in as a member of Congress was the REINS Act, H.R. 367, and I'm pleased to have voted for it today. The bill increases accountability and creates transparency in the federal regulatory process by requiring Congress to approve all new major regulations. With the REINS Act, no longer will bureaucrats in the fourth branch go unchecked, and the constitutional balance of our founders deliberately drafted would be restored. I'll continue to fight for a government that is smaller, more efficient, more streamlined, and more responsive to hard-working taxpayers. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to take from the Speaker's table H.R. 1344 with the Senate amendment thereto, and to concur in the Senate amendment.
The clerk will report the title of the bill and the Senate amendment.
H.R. 1344, an act to amend Title 49, United States Code, to direct the Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security, Transportation Security Administration to provide expedited air passenger screening to severely injured or disabled members of the armed forces and severely injured or disabled veterans, and for other purposes. Senate amendment.
Without objection, the Senate amendment is agreed to, and the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
All right.
The chair lays before the House a privileged concurrent resolution.
Senate Concurrent Resolution 22. Resolved that when the Senate recesses or adjourns on any day from Thursday, August 1st, 2013 through Sunday, August 11th, 2013, on a motion offered pursuant to this concurrent resolution by its majority leader or his designee, it stand recessed or adjourned until 12 noon on Monday, August 12th, 2013, or such other time on that day as may be specified by its majority leader or his designee, and the motion to recess or adjourn, and that when the Senate recesses or adjourns on Monday, August 12, 2013, it stand adjourned until 12 noon on Monday, September 9th, 2013, or such other time on that day as may be specified by its majority leader or his designee, or until the time of any reassembly pursuant to Section 2 of this concurrent resolution, whichever occurs first, and that when the House adjourns on any legislative day from Friday, August 2nd, 2013, through Friday, September 6th, 2013, on a motion offered pursuant to this concurrent resolution by its majority leader or his designee, it stand adjourned until 2 p.m. on Monday, September 9th, 2013, or until the time of any reassembly pursuant to Section 2 of this concurrent resolution, whichever occurs first. Section 2. The majority leader of the Senate and the Speaker of the House or their respective designees, acting jointly after consultation with the minority leader of the Senate and the minority leader of the House, shall notify the members of the Senate and House respectively to reassemble at such place and time as they may designate if, in their opinion, the public interest shall warrant it.
Without objection, the concurrent resolution is agreed to, and a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The Chair announces the Speaker's appointment pursuant to Section 803A of the Congressional Recognition for Excellence in Arts Education Act, 2 U.S.C. 803A, and the order of the House of January 3, 2013, of the following member on the part of the House to the Congressional Award Board.
Mr. Hudson of North Carolina.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege and honor to be recognized to address you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives and to be able to cover some of the subject matter that sets the stage and the tone and some of the things that I think we should be thinking about as we take this traditional August work period and go back to our individual districts and hear from our constituents. There are a number of us that have constituents that have guided this country in the right direction, that have given a considerable contribution to this nation, and I think it's an appropriate time for us to commemorate some of those individuals as well as highlight in some important agenda moving into the other side of Labor Day. So to begin that process, Mr. Speaker, I'd be pleased to yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, as much time as he may consume to address this topic matter. Gentleman from Florida? I mean from Texas? Excuse me. What am I thinking?
Mr. Speaker, on July 30th, our nation lost Ronnie Jackson, a community treasurer of Bryan, Texas. Mr. Jackson was a longtime public servant in the role of Neighborhood and Youth Services Director for our city. Mr. Jackson passed away at the age of 63 after fighting lung cancer for 17 months. Mr. Jackson spent his life as an educator and worked tirelessly for many organizations, including the MHMR Authority of Brazos Valley, the Boys and Girls Club of Brazos Valley, Big Brothers and Big Sisters of the Brazos Valley. He also spent time volunteering at programs for youth, seniors, and in neighborhoods throughout the community. Mr. Jackson was recognized for his service when he was a 2010 national finalist for the Jefferson Award, which is the Nobel Prize for Community and Public Service. He was well known in Bryan and impacted the lives of many throughout the community. Ever selfless, even while battling cancer, Mr. Jackson still made time to work and serve in his community. He was described by many as hardworking, devoted, and a kind man. In fact, Bryan City Secretary Mary Lynn Stratus said in a newspaper interview earlier this summer that Mr. Jackson was the heartbeat of the programs that he led. My thoughts and prayer with the family and friends of Mr. Ronnie Jackson. He will forever be remembered as an outstanding husband and a community servant. Bryan, Texas, and all of the Brazos Valley are a better community because of him. God bless his family and our community as we mourn his passing. Mr. Speaker, before I close, I ask that all Americans continue to pray for our country during these difficult times and for our military and first responders who protect us here at home, who protect us abroad and at home. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, on July 26th, our nation lost a great American, Mr. George P. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell was a revolutionary energy pioneer, philanthropist, and Texas A&M graduate, class of 1940. He was 94 years old and passed away on July 26, 2013. Mr. Mitchell was a native of Texas, born in Galveston, and later attended Texas A&M University, where he worked his way through school, studied petroleum engineering and geology, and graduated top of his class. Throughout his life, Mr. Mitchell upheld the Aggie core values of excellence, integrity, leadership, loyalty, respect, and selfless service. After attending Texas A&M University, Mr. Mitchell served as a captain in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers during World War II. He later built his own company, Mitchell Energy and Development, which was responsible for over 550 significant oil and gas discoveries. Mr. Mitchell led the way in the energy business with his groundbreaking innovations, which contributed to the expanded application of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. In addition, he is the catalyst behind many significant improvements to these technologies for over 3 decades. He is the man behind this energy revolution we have today that is putting us on the path to energy security in America. In addition to his pioneering influence in the energy sector, Mr. Mitchell provided leadership in community development and service. He developed the Woodlands, a 27,000-acre community north of Houston. He used $50 million of his personal money to renovate landmarks in Galveston and founded the Houston Advanced Research Center, which is a nonprofit scientific and research facility. He has also benefited higher education through his family gifts of tens of millions of dollars to our alma mater, Texas A&M University. My thoughts and prayers are with the family and friends of Mr. George Mitchell. He will forever be remembered as an outstanding husband, an outstanding father, an outstanding Texas Aggie, a Texas businessman, an American energy leader, and a community servant. Thank you, and I yield back to Mr. King.
Reclaim my time. I thank the gentleman from Texas for bringing these two fine individuals before this Congress and commemorating their contributions in their lives to this country. And one individual that has been making a contribution in each of his days and years here in Congress is a gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wolf, who has, Mr. Speaker, has taken the lead on the Benghazi issue, and he has consistently, persistently, and relentlessly illuminated the reasons for us to take a much closer look and dig into the bottom of Benghazi. I'd be happy to yield as much time as the gentleman from Virginia may consume to address that topic.
I want to thank the gentleman from Iowa for Mr. King for the time. I'm very grateful. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, last evening, CNN reported startling new revelations about efforts by the CIA to prevent agency employees and contractors from speaking to the press and Congress about the terrorist attacks in Benghazi last September. According to CNN, quote, since January, some CIA operatives involved in the agency's missions in Libya have been subjected to frequent, even monthly, polygraph examinations, according to a source with deep inside knowledge of the agency's workings. The goal of the questioning, according to sources, is to find out if anyone is talking to the media or talking to Congress, end of quote. This report confirms what I have been saying for months. Survivors of the attack are being silenced. By failing to have public hearings over the last year, the Congress has empowered the government to silence the eyewitnesses from the attack. This is unacceptable. The CIA says that the agency employees are always free to speak to Congress if they want. However, the reported monthly polygraphs clearly contradict these assertions. Just listen to the following comments reported by CNN. Quote, you don't jeopardize yourself, you jeopardize your family as well, one CIA source told CNN. Quote, you have no idea the amount of pressure being brought to bear on anyone with knowledge of this operation, another said, end of quote. According to a separate report by Fox News this morning, quote, at least 5 CIA employees were forced to sign additional non-disclosure agreements this past spring in wake of the Benghazi attack, confirming what I said on the House floor on July 18th. 4 Americans were killed in a terrorist attack on 2 U.S. facilities. 7 Americans were wounded, some severely. Another 24 could have been killed that night but for the sacrifices made by Ty Woods, Glenn Doherty, Dave Ubben, and untold others who deserve to be recognized for their heroic acts. Why are these heroes being told not to talk? What is the administration afraid of? What is it protecting? Nearly 6 months ago, I wrote Secretary Kerry asking for the names and contact information of the State Department employees who were in Benghazi last September. The Department refused to provide this information or even confirm the number of those wounded and the nature of their injuries. I again made this request to Secretary Kerry earlier this month, and once again, the Department refused. During the July 24th State Department press briefing, The department spokesman again made excuses for not providing this information to Congress, and once again used the FBI as an excuse not to cooperate, stating, quote, "We have serious concerns about the survivors' welfare and want to be careful not to interfere with the FBI's investigation of the attack," end of quote. And then asserting, quote, "There are no department employees who want to tell their story that are being obstructed from doing so by the leadership of the State Department," end of quote. How can the Congress know the survivors don't want to speak with Congress if they can't learn who they are and ask them? Are we really to take the administration's word for it? Nearly every day for the past 3 weeks, I've come to the floor to ask questions that should be answered by now. These have ranged from whether there was an intelligence failure that night, to who was responsible for the U.S. response, the State Department, Defense Department, or the CIA, to just why we had such a large CIA presence operating in Benghazi in the first place. The failure to provide answers to the American people, despite nearly a year of investigations, makes clear the need for a new approach. I believe the best path forward is a dedicated, bipartisan House Select Committee with full subpoena authority to hold public hearings and issue a public final report. 162 of our colleagues, nearly three-quarters of the majority, agree, and that is why they have co-sponsored HRES 36 to create a bipartisan select committee. This effort has been supported by the family members of the Benghazi victims, the Special Operations Community, the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, which represents the diplomatic security officers that were in Benghazi, as well as the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. With such a broad range of support, it begs the question, why not? What are we afraid of from a full investigation and public hearings? The House Interim Progress Report in Benghazi was released on April 23rd. When will the final report be released? HRES 36 would mandate a final report within 90 days. It would also have full subpoena authority to compel sworn testimony from all witnesses. It would bring together the best investigators from all the committees in the House, and it would use existing resources. It would not duplicate effort. It would build on the work that's already been done over the past year. Iron sharpens iron. When we return from August recess, there will only be 2 days until the one-year anniversary of the Benghazi attack. Can any member here confidently say they know what happened that night? Can any member honestly say, with reports like the one CNN did yesterday, that this Congress has done everything it can to allow the survivors to come forward and tell their story? Witnesses need to be subpoenaed. I'm talking about friendly subpoenas to the survivors and those career federal employees in theater and in Washington who witnessed the response or lack thereof that night. Some have argued we shouldn't issue subpoenas until we know what a witness will say. That won't work, especially given the non-disclosure agreements and polygraphs being deployed to silence them. And they need to speak publicly, because speaking behind closed doors offers them no protection. My congressional district includes the CIA and a number of other intelligence agencies. Throughout my career, I have talked to and worked with countless career federal employees and contractors working for intelligence agencies. I know the pressure they're under to stay silent, even if they have information that the Congress and the American people need to hear. They need the protection of a subpoena. There is no other way. Until we hear in public from these witnesses what happened that night, we'll never be able to answer the many unanswered questions I have raised daily on the House floor over the past 3 weeks, which I'm submitting together today for the record. September 11th is fast approaching. Will we continue on our current path and learn from forthcoming books written by survivors and sanitized by the CIA, or will we create a select committee to subpoena witnesses to testify under oath at public hearings? And I thank the gentleman for yielding of the time.
and Mr. Speaker, reclaiming my time, and this time here today, I'm switched to a topic, but first I want to address that I've been very, very supportive of Congressman Wolf's initiative for a select committee and bringing these witnesses in under subpoena so that we can get to the bottom of this, because America's legacy and America's history is at stake. And when I think about America's legacy and America's history, this day I come to the floor with my eyes and my memory and my heart full of the last 2 days of saying goodbye to America's greatest living hero up until the time of his death, Colonel Bud Day. Colonel Bud Day, just a moment. This is one image I would point out, Mr. Speaker, of the Bud Day that I knew, the man that I had the privilege to call a friend, the man that I admired, at our time, a living American hero. Colonel Bud Day was, up until the time of his death, the most decorated living American hero. I believe we had to go back to General MacArthur to find someone who was more decorated than Bud Day. To put this in a short capsule, Mr. Speaker, Colonel Bud Day served in 3 wars. He volunteered as a high school senior when he heard that there was going to be a draft. He abhorred the thought of having to draft people to serve our country in a time of war, and he immediately went down to the courthouse to see the Marine recruiter. He served in World War II, he served in the Korean War, he served in the Vietnam War, he became a prisoner of war, and was repatriated and brought back to the United States and with his family in 1973. Bud Day received the Medal of Honor. He received 70-some other medals. Every available combat medal that was available to him in the theaters that he fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam had been awarded to Bud Day. Bud Day was the one who, in the Hanoi Hilton, he and one other POW's cell is where they brought John McCain when John McCain was in a body cast, has been expressed, was rattling around inside a body cast weighing about 75 pounds. They brought John McCain in and threw him on Bud Day's bunk. And the 2 individuals began to heal John McCain back to health. This life of this man is full of service in 3 wars, and he served our country through, as I add them up, through the decade of the 40s in World War II, the decade of the 50s in the Korean War, the decade of the 60s, and the early 70s in the Vietnam War. He came back and continued to serve his country up until nearly the 80s in the service, and then went into service in practicing law in Florida. So that would be through the 90s, and as recently as just a few days ago, he won another case shortly before he died. Bud Day was a fighter, he was a scrapper, he was an American patriot. And Mr. Speaker, I come here to the floor today to tell a more thorough narrative of Colonel Bud Day. And I want to point out first that much of that narrative is in one of 2 books that are of and about Bud. This one is by him. And when you read it, it's Duty, Honor, Country, Colonel George Bud Day, Warrior, Lawyer. And when you read Duty, Honor, Country, you hear the flavor and the thread of his conversation. This is, you'll see and read books that are written by ghostwriters, and they will go in and interview the extraordinary person and put that into narrative form, and you can read the book, and when you read that, you don't always get the feel and the flavor of the character. In this one, I see the language that Bud Day used constantly coming up, and it's flowery language. It's actually almost always very tasteful language, but he saw images that were I'll say, captured in his mind's eye, that he kept in his memory for years, and he expressed them in this book. And going back to read it a second time upon the occasion of his death, the personality of Bud Day emerges in this book, Mr. Speaker. And yet, so I'd like to go down through the history of the life of Colonel Bud Day. And I was able to, as I said, call him a friend. We were hunting buddies. We spent a lot of time out in the fields of Iowa together with a shotgun, stopping to rest, talking politics, talking history, talking the history of war, refighting some wars while we were at it. But the beginning of his life was in February 24th, 1925, and Colonel Day was then, of course, George Bud Day was born in Sioux City, Iowa. He went to Riverside High School, and he's born in Riverside, which is a suburb of Sioux City, and he went to Central High School in Sioux City, where he learned that there was when he learned that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and he saw that in 1942, remember that was December 7th, 1941, in 1942, when he heard there was going to be a draft, Bud Day decided that he would go down and sign up, and he saw the Marine recruiter and became a Marine. And then from that point, he served 2.5 years in the South Pacific, and he came back home in 1945 and went to college at Morningside College there in Sioux City. And shortly after that went up to the University of South Dakota in Vermilion, South Dakota, and received his law degree up there. By 1949, Marine Bud Day had an undergraduate degree at Morningside College and a Juris Doctorate law degree from the University of South Dakota, where he thought he would go and practice law. But he also served in the Iowa National Guard from 1950, and he attended flight school because he wanted to fly. So, therefore, in 1951, the Air Force called Bud Day to active duty, and he was a fighter pilot in the Korean War. He served 2 tours as a fighter pilot in the Korean War. That experience there, growing up in Sioux City, anchored him to the 185th Air Guard that is based today in Sioux City. He maintained his relationships with the people that serve there, with the airmen that serve out of the 185th in Sioux City. Sioux City was always his home. He kept his contacts there, but he transferred his family down to Pensacola, Florida, in that area because there is a lot of military down there, and of course it's a great place to live. I came back from there last night, having joined in the funeral and the procession to the cemetery for Colonel Bud Day. But after his Korean War experience, where he served 2 tours, he decided to make the Air Force a career. One of the things he did was he was deployed to the base at Niagara in New York, which he euphemistically called Nigeria, but they loved it up there, and he built good bonds with people and strong bonds, and he took his flying hours up, and with those flying hours that he had, he became one of the most experienced pilots to be deployed to Vietnam. And so he anticipated that he would retire in 1968, but then Major Day volunteered for a tour in Vietnam, and he was assigned to the 31st Tactical Fighter Wing at Toi Ho Air Base, and that was in April of 1967. There he commanded the wing called the Misty wing, and that was because Bud Day named them so. Misty was his favorite song. And they flew missions over North and South Vietnam, and many of them, the most dangerous missions by far, were over North Vietnam. And on a mission over North Vietnam, in an F-100, it was they were spotting and locating surface-to-air missiles that had freshly been placed there, Russian surface-to-air missiles that had the capability of taking down B-52s. As they located the Russian surface-to-air missile site, they were hit by enemy fire. Some say it was an enemy missile. In Bud's book, he says he thinks they took a direct hit from a 37mm anti-aircraft weapon. But in any case, it hit the fuselage of the F-100 and took their flight down, and he had to, as he said, punch out. And there he was imprisoned then, immediately captured by the North Vietnamese, and was imprisoned for 5 years and 7 months, and became the highest-ranking officer in that prison. And so he commanded people like John McCain during that period of time. But throughout all that long ordeal that our American prisoners of war served in they euphemistically called it the Hanoi Hilton, throughout that long ordeal, Bud maintained his spirit, he maintained his strength, and he gave encouragement to the others who were there, and he defied his captors in a way that I think amazed the people that served there with him. When he was released on March 14th, 1973, he was reunited with his wife, Dory, and their 4 children, Steve, George, and the two daughters. And then he was presented the Medal of Honor in Medal of Honor by Gerald Ford, President Ford, in 1976. In all, as I said, over 70 medals, every medal available to him, a combat medal from each field that he served in, each war, each theater, and he was the only person ever to have been awarded both the Medal of Honor and the Air Force Cross. And then Bud Day retired from active duty in 1977, resumed practicing law in Florida. And one of the issues that he took on was TRICARE. And then in the 90s, he saw that the Clinton administration was starting to back away from the commitment that if you served 20 years in the armed forces, you would receive half your pay as your pension for life and medical care for life. That was the deal. That was the agreement. And he was appalled that the federal government was starting to move away from that agreement. So Bud Day, ever the fighter, ever the scrapper, ever the lawyer, went to court and put together a class action lawsuit to force the federal government to keep their word with our warriors. And most of that was designed to benefit America's greatest generation, the World War II veterans. And we've lost so many of them since that period of time. But as Bud Day drove that lawsuit and worked his way up through the courts, and he got all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court refused to hear the case, refused to grant cert, as the ruling was. And so the indomitable Colonel Bud Day, Medal of Honor recipient, decided, okay, if we can't get what's right done in the courts, I'll go to Congress. So he took this argument to Congress, and if I have my dates right, it was in 2002 that Congress passed TRICARE. We've had a good number of debates on TRICARE since then. I don't believe we would have TRICARE at all if it weren't for Colonel Bud Day. And yesterday I parted with his family, as Doris, or Dory as he affectionately called the Viking, and when I read in his book when he talked about her ice blue eyes, I saw them sad yesterday, but they're still bright and they're still ice blue and there's still a sparkle behind the tears. And the family is strongly together with Steve and George Jr. and Sandra and Sonia and 14 grandchildren. And it was a ceremony and a service like no other for a man that there'll never be another like, Colonel Bud Day. And of these experiences, I've looked through a number of articles and recognizing, Mr. Speaker, that I probably can't be the best author to commemorate the life of a great, iconic man that has captured this country. So I will take you down through a bit of a narrative on from a story. And here's one of the things that Bud Day did. I'll just take you through the narrative of the way he treated death multiple times. Now, remember, this is a man that signed up for the Marine Corps in 1942, Mr. Speaker, and was able to come back from 2.5 years being deployed to the South Pacific and get his college undergrad degree and his law degree, went into the Iowa Guard because he wanted to fly, and he did fly, and he volunteered to go to Korea, and there served 2 tours flying a fighter bomber or a bomber over Korea, and then was, while he was flying training missions, he was deployed different places. Georgia, for example, and then over to England, a base in England. And here are the number of times that Bud Day cheated death. The first one that I recall was when he was flying out of a base in Georgia, and a fighter aircraft had the fuel doors were open, and he had a leak, and there was a plane that was flying next to him that said, "You've got a leak." It looked like it was a fatal mechanical error. He didn't have enough altitude to bail out, and he didn't have enough power to land, so he wasn't going to be able to sustain his power to land. And Bud Day gave you an example of what he was going to be able to do for a lifetime, and that is, in quick thinking, the kind of thing that a more experienced pilot, in fact, pilots would likely be trained on this after they found out what Bud Day had done, and that is that he did the only thing that he could do that would save his life. He put the nose of that plane down, knowing that if he could get to 170 knots, that those sucker doors would close, and if they closed, it would shut off the risk of the fire. And so he put that nose down in a courageous way, and right before he got to the treetops, he was able to reach 170 knots. In doing so, the sucker doors closed, and he was able to stabilize the aircraft and land it safely. That was the first time that's recorded that Colonel Bud Day cheated death. Not very long after that, he was flying out of a base in England, and the name of the base, I think, is a pretty important one, and I know that I marked it here in my notes, Mr. Speaker, but it was yeah, I'm going to find that in a second. But it was, okay, excuse me, Mr. Speaker, the name of the base was Wethersfield, England, and it was just pretty interesting that the uniqueness of that. But as Bud Day flew out of England, and he had another situation where he had an engine fire at low altitude, and there was no ability to set the plane down. He got it on a course where it would be away from population, and as he was in a lower altitude, around 500 or so feet, the only choice he really had was to eject. Although, so he ejected, and he looked up, and he said, "Where's the chute? Where is the chute?" It was a no chute, no opening, no blossom, no orange blossom, and he joked that fighter pilots or plane pilots will often argue, if your chute doesn't work, just take it back. And here is a man in a no-chute bailout of a jet aircraft trailing down through the skies with the chute not opening, no blossom, just trailing down through. He went through the timber in England, the pine timber in England, and if any of us, Mr. Speaker, remember when Rambo jumped out of the helicopter and went through the trees and survived that fall, I don't know where the inspiration came for that scene in Rambo, but when I think of this happening to Colonel Bud Day, that this man survived a no-chute bailout as the chute wouldn't open, and as it strung down through the skies, he went into the pine tree and bounced off the branches, and as those branches began to break his fall, some of the chute, the threads on the chute, the cords, he slowed down a little bit on the branches, and he hit the ground. He hit the ground hard. He broke his ankle. He was injured in other places, but he was alive. The first person to survive a no-chute bailout of a jet aircraft. He did so in England in 1957. It was the second time he cheated death. The third time that he cheated death was in a 0-0 landing. And it was only 5 months after he had gone through his no-chute bailout. Now remember, this is a man that had the presence of mind to put the nose down on a fighter aircraft and head toward the ground, knowing that if he didn't reach that speed, that 170 knots, he was not going to be able to survive that flight. And to pull it up right above the trees, have the airspeed that he needed to get the sucker doors closed, to stabilize the aircraft, and to land it. And then here we are, not that long later, to be flying in England and have to bail out of a burning aircraft and go through and not have your chute open. And what did he say? Well, he expressed that it was an old Royal Air Force expression. He said that, I thought out loud, I bought the farm. What a lousy way to go. But he went through the trees, and he looked up and he said, flyers have an old bad joke about parachutes. If it doesn't open, take it back. There are not many members of that Take It Back Club. Colonel Bud Day was one of those members. And then the ejection, it was from an F-84, and it was the first in Air Force history for anyone that should survive from it. And Colonel Bud Day said, God must be saving me for something. In fact, his wife said to him, God must be saving you for something. And it was less than 6 months later that he was flying out of Wethersfield Royal Air Force Station in England, and they took off to go get some parts. They were cleared by the weather. The weather cleared. It was supposed to open up and stay open across Europe and the alternating landing forces that they had. But instead, the fog socked in. The visibility socked down to 0. The ceiling went to 0. And Bud Day said the weather was so bad that not even the birds flew in it. But they flew that F-80, that F-80C, and they were hoping the weather would reverse itself. His co-pilot was Bill Moore, or known affectionately as Billy Moore. And so they had a choice. With everything socked in, they decided to turn back and go back to the Wethersfield airstrip, because that's the one they knew the best. That's the one that didn't have a lot of urban areas around it or a lot of housing. They had a pretty much clear approach to landing, and if they didn't make it, it was less likely that they would kill other people other than themselves. So they turned and went back to Wethersfield. And Bud Day is thinking, I don't want to bail out of this plane again. My ankle's just healing up from the last time my chute didn't open. So I want to come in and land this. And Billy Moore agreed it was the best choice that they could make. So they approached the landing strip, And as they approached it, this is a complete instrument landing with zero visibility and zero ceiling, and it was black as it could be. And the first approach, Bud said to his co-pilot, Billy Moore, you take the controls, I'll watch. And if I can see the runway, I'll take the controls from you the instant right before we land, and I'll land it. Because Bud sitting in the front was the only guy that could see the land of the runway. And so as they made that first approach, right before they would have made it, I'll just say touchdown and impact was an unknown, what that would be at the time. Right before they touched down, Bud Day saw that they were off the side of the runway. He saw a light on the side of the runway. He said, pull it back up. So they pulled it back up, and they went back around again, and they adjusted the radar again, and as they approached a complete instrument landing, zero ceiling, zero visibility, right before impact, right before they touched, Bud had said to Billy Moore, pull it back up. But that instant he realized they were lined up, and within just an instant of making contact with the runway, Bud Day took the controls and set that plane down. And it was the first 0-0 landing that they had survived. And he said that, he said to Billy Moore, his co-pilot, he said, good show, pal. That was about as scary as it's going to get. I think we owe the radar controllers a beer. That tells you something about the spirit of this man. He said, I didn't want to bail out again. My leg and back are still sore from the last bailout. And you know, Bill, we may be the only pilots living today that have made a zero visibility, zero ceiling landing. And I think that turned out to be true. Later on, Bud Day volunteered then for combat duty in Vietnam, where he went on to command the squadron there. And as they were flying over that SAM site, that surface-to-air missile site, his captain was Corwin Kippenham of Amana, Iowa. The two Iowans together in that flight as they were hit and shot down on that day. They punched out. Bud Day was taken prisoner immediately. There was a third time he cheated death when they took a direct hit on the fuselage of that plane. And as he bailed out, this time his chute did open. But when it opened, it settled him down in the location where he was immediately taken captive. And his co-pilot, Kip as he was known, was rescued right away. And as Bud Day is on the ground looking up, there was an American helicopter that was hovering off at a close distance. They were looking for him, and he was in the trees, and they couldn't see him, but Bud could see the helicopter. And standing in the side of that helicopter door was his co-pilot with a rifle in his hand. They were looking to go get Bud Day. If they'd have seen him, they would have been able to recover him. But of course, that didn't happen, and he was put into captivity. So 3 times he cheated death. And as they beat him and as they tortured him, as they put him in a hole, he had his arm broken in 3 places. He had other injuries from the bailout. He had hit the side of the plane on the way out and suffered those injuries. But they drove him and marched him through the villages in what they would like to have called a march of shame. But he was put under guard by a young Vietnamese, a teenager, whom Bud Day feigned that he was hurt badly. It was hard for him to walk. His knee was bad. His arm was broken 3 places. But he feigned that he was worse than he was, and he noticed that his captor would go off and talk to another guard because he believed that Bud could not move, could not get out of the hole that he was in, and that he wouldn't be able to travel, so he was a relaxed kind of a guard that wasn't really paying attention. Bud recognized that, he exploited that, and he feigned his injuries to be, it was bad, but he feigned them to be worse than they were. And as he did so, that guard got more and more relaxed, and after several days, Bud saw his opportunity. They were going to move him then on up to North Vietnam to the Hanoi Hilton is what it sounded like. There was some expression the guard had drawn a picture into the dirt of a Jeep, and that said that they were going to transport him. So they went in and tied his legs together with a cord, and they left him there. Bud Day knew that within hours or a day or so, they were going to come and get him, and once he went to the next stage of his captivity, each day that goes by, it gets harder and harder to escape. And so, as the guard went over to talk to his friend and had his back turned, Bud Day was able to untie the cords that tied his legs together, even though he only had one arm to do it and the other one broken in 3 places. When he did that, he had to pick a time that he thought the guard was as relaxed as possible, and he got out of that hole and he headed out through the jungle to try to get down to the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, and to try to get then across the DMZ, cross a river, swim across a river, and then try to get into American hands that looked like it was going to be a long trip, and it was. Bud Day had a canteen. He had some water in it. He was able to refill that sometimes from water that was captured from rainwater in banana leaves that he would stop and refill his canteen. He went for days without eating, days without thinking about eating. He was so focused on avoiding the V, as he called them, the North Vietnamese military, but also the Viet Cong. And as he's traveling through North Vietnam, traveling through enemy territory, he had to be ever alert to maintain hiding and travel at night part of the time for the first couple, 3 days of his trip, because that was the only way it would be safe. But to try to navigate at night through the canopy of the jungle and try to follow trails that you don't know where they go is a very, very difficult task, and to keep his mind on task as he got weaker and weaker was a struggle that is something that is so impressive to see that he was able to hold it together. And he wouldn't have said that he held it together. He went up and down through delirium, and he would discipline his mind back to focusing on staying alive, because he remembered his beloved wife, Dory. He remembered his children. He remembered the people that he flew with, the Misty pilots and the Misty team that was out there. He prayed to God to come and save him. The 23rd Psalm was his favorite psalm, and when he didn't know what else to pray, he prayed the 23rd Psalm. It happens to also be my mother's and mine. As he worked his way down south and was able to build himself the equivalent of a little bamboo raft and go into that river, and the river that he said was equivalent to, and Bud Day grew up on the Missouri River and played out there on the Missouri River, where I've spent a fair amount of time outside of Sioux City, but he said the river was equivalent to the Missouri River at St. Louis. A lot of water. It was flowing fast. When he put into it, he thought that it would be slower than it was. It was flowing more than 7 or 8 miles an hour. That's about what the river flows around up in Sioux City, Iowa today. It took him downstream fast, but he was able to get across the other side, and with arm broken in 3 places and all. And as he emerged from the river, he had to struggle his way through the jungle, starving, hungry, weak from hunger, and he found a cache of U.S. military, we would call them today MREs. And he thought, I found the mother lode of food. Now I can re-energize myself, I can store up with food, I can get my energy back, and I'll be able to go on. But each can that he picked up had been bayoneted, because it was likely U.S. Marines who couldn't carry all of the food with them. They ate their fill, and in that jungle, if you poke a hole in a can, it only takes a little while and that food is spoiled, so it was all spoiled. But he was glad to see that the Marines were following the due diligence and their combat training that they'd had. And throughout this, you'll hear his voice kind of go up in despair, and then he'd check himself and say, what are you complaining about, Bud? It's a great day. The sun came up in a bright way this morning. He's had good weather to speak with, to travel with, and he found a way to find a blessing in thing after thing. If that meant, and he was shelled and escaped death then. U.S. bombs were dropping around him in a close area. He escaped death then. He had to go barefoot across the craters of a bomb field, where some of the sand turns into glass. It cut his feet. His feet were swollen. He was wounded from some of that. And, of course, an arm broken in 3 places. 10 to 12 days he wandered across the desert, always re-navigating, always resetting himself, always disciplining himself to stay on task, stay on task. God is saving you for something. And throughout those days of courage, he was faced multiple times with North Vietnamese regulars and military, North Vietnamese military, that at any slip-up, if he hid in the wrong place, if they looked in the wrong place, if he made a motion, he would have been captured. And outside of Khe Sanh, which was a Marine base about 2 kilometers or perhaps 2 miles from there, Bud Day's luck ran out, and he's encountered by a couple of young North Vietnamese who were either preparing to assault Khe Sanh or trying to assault any supply chains that would be coming to it. And they discovered Bud Day, who then, when he realized he was discovered, now remember, he'd lost about 25 pounds. He went into this weighing about 150. Maybe at this time it's less than 125 pounds. He's weak from hunger. He's eaten frogs, and drank some water and a little bit of pulp from a plant, a banana tree that he took apart, and that's about it. So you can imagine how weak he must have been, how wounded he was with a bad knee and an arm broken in 3 places, but he got up to run, and as he ran, he made it a ways, he got through the jungle a ways, but as they shot at him, he took a bullet through the thigh and a bullet through the hand. And he continued to run to evade his captors, who nearly didn't find him, but at the last minute, as they happened to find themselves standing next to him, not realizing it, they captured him. And they captured him and they pressed him back again and sent him back to Hanoi, to the Hanoi Hilton, where all of these days of disciplining his mind and himself, that resolve that was there, went away, because he lost all of those days and went back into the Hanoi Hilton. This is the man whose spirit held together, and when they began to torture him in an even more sophisticated and even more relentless fashion, they would hang him by his feet for hours. They would beat him with fan belts. And he said that, here's an expression from the 15th chapter of his autobiography, and this chapter is titled Crucifixion. He vividly details the most violent and barbaric tortures he endured. There were, he called them rope tricks. That gives you a sense of Bud Day's sense of humor. Well, they had rope tricks that literally dislocated shoulders and tore muscles, flesh-piercing leg irons, torture cuffs, and kneeling on sharp objects for days on end until the knees became raw, bloody stumps. Beat him with fan belts. And he would pray, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." This is something that I think needs to go into the record verbatim, Mr. Speaker. Bud Day, ever the warrior, prayed, "Jesus, if I survive this nightmare, I will have divine understanding. I am your brother in blood and deed. I am being crucified. I know Satan. I have seen the deepest rings of hell. I am in the pit, Lord, and I am fading. My strength is waning. Give me strength, dear God. Strength. I cannot bear the thought of my wife and our children hearing that I am a traitor. I cannot live in disgrace with my fellow prisoners." Close quote. Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker, the spirit of a man who feared he would disgrace his fellow prisoners? He couldn't bear the thought of becoming a traitor. He couldn't bear the thought of not seeing his beloved wife, Dory, and the kids again. This was Colonel Bud Day. This is the spirit of the man who gave courage and inspiration to all of those in the Hanoi Hilton. And I recall the day we commemorated the statue of Bud Day at the airport in Sioux City, where we got together and named the airstrip after Colonel Bud Day. There's a statue there of Bud Day, and it's a bronze statue that I'll describe in a moment, Mr. Speaker. But Bud Day's defiance to his captors, they would point a rifle at his head and threaten to execute him, and Bud Day would stand there and sing the national anthem. There was another prisoner of war who was first blamed for organizing a prayer session, and a number of them took the oath, that essentially an oath that they would hold their ground and insist that they were going to do prayer sessions. And as the Vietnamese marched them off, the first one to be marched off was beaten and bloodied and being hauled off. And what does Bud Day do? Stood up on his bunk and sang the national anthem at the top of his lungs. And that voice of him singing the national anthem echoed across these cell blocks. They couldn't all see each other, Mr. Speaker, but they could hear. And they echoed it across the cell blocks. They all stood up and sang the national anthem at the top of their lungs. And they asked that prisoner, "What did that make you feel like?" And he said, "It made me feel like I was 9 feet tall, ready to hunt bear with a switch." And the statue of Bud Day that commemorates the Bud Day airstrip in Sioux City is a bronze statue 9 feet tall. And I remember the day that his twin daughters unveiled that statue from the roof of the airport building, where they pulled the tarp off and showed us the statue of Colonel Bud Day, the man who cheated death time after time after time, the man whom a lot of us wouldn't have believed that that would end his life, even that he could cheat nature. I thought he might have been able to do that. I listened to the remarks made by John McCain on the floor of the Senate this Monday, and I was impressed by that delivery, by the poignant moments that John McCain captured. And I would just hit some of those highlights because I think it's so important, and I was so impressed with his presentation. And I think it's very close to the delivery that he gave yesterday and at the service. He said that Bud had supplied enough, his lifetime supplied enough experiences, excitement, and satisfaction for 10 lifetimes. He knew terror and suffering, joy and deliverance. He knew solidarity, self-respect, and dignity. And this is John McCain still. The Vietnamese left me to die in the prison cell Bud shared with Major Norris Overley. Bud and Norris wouldn't let me die. They bathed me, fed me, nursed me, encouraged me, and ordered me back to life. Norris did much of the work because Bud had healing of his own to do, to paraphrase. But to quote, continue the quote, Bud showed me how to save my self-respect and my honor. And that is a debt I can never repay. Close quote from John McCain. Continuing to quote, Bud was a fierce, and I mean really fierce, resistor. He could not be broken in spirit no matter how broken he was in body. He defied men who had the power of life and death over us. To witness him sing the national anthem in response to having a rifle pointed at his face, well, that was something to behold. In 1967, Bud Day, and close quote, Bud Day commanded a squadron of F-100s that served as forward air controllers over Vietnam. They were called the Misties because it was Bud's favorite song. And on August 26 of 1967, Bud Day was one of the casualties over Vietnam. And now I want to spend just a moment, now continuing the quote of Senator McCain, Bud was the bravest man I ever knew, and I've known more than a few. He was great company, too, and it made it possible to actually have fun in prison once in a while. Close quote. Extraordinary statement to make, knowing the pain, the agony, and the torture that they all went through there in the Hanoi Hilton in that prisoner of war camp. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to relate, the Bud Day that I knew. The Bud Day that, we see him here, the Bud Day, the Bud Day of his later years, the happy face, the sparkle in his eyes, that look, that smile. Anybody that knew Bud Day understood this man by looking at this picture. It captured him. It literally and actually captured the real man that was there. This is the Bud Day that I knew. The Bud Day that he loved to hunt and fish, he loved the outdoors, and as busy as he was and as active in his law practice up till the last days of his life, he still made time to go out to the field. He made time to come back to Iowa, South Dakota, that area that he grew up in, that he knew so well and loved so much. He always kept his connections with his home territory. And as we went out in the field year after year and hunted pheasants together primarily, South Dakota and Iowa, I would tell a little narrative. Now think of this fighter pilot that's been through so much, who could fly up through that valley of death and tell you the narrative of all the anti-aircraft that was being fired at them, and the surface-to-air missiles that were fired at them, and of course small arms fire that they'd fire at them all constantly. And here's how Bud Day would explain it. It was really exciting. Now can you imagine a man with the kind of courage that would be facing death by expressing, it was really exciting. And so this is a man that they loved the outdoors, he loved to hunt, he loved to shoot, and we would put together hunts today, and we'll do another one this fall. Again, it's going to be the Bud Day pheasant hunt. But this is the sparkle in the eye that he always wore the sunglasses out there, but I know this sparkle in his eye. That smile on his face, anybody would know. From there and down, the people that knew Bud Day would smile. If you hold your hand like this and you stretch it out, you'll know that's the action of him stretching the tendons in his injured hand that he did constantly at rest. That hand would always be stretching those tendons back out. And in that ceremony yesterday, there was eulogy after eulogy by other true American heroes, other Medal of Honor recipients, others that flew and fought with him were part of the Misty Squadron, and the families, the military wives that were there, the people in that room, the 4 stars on shoulders time after time. And as I looked around that room and I saw all that brass, I thought, there are at least enough stars here for a constellation at this funeral, probably enough for a galaxy if you look at all the people whose lives he touched. And in the 4 legs of my journey down there, in 3 of them, someone approached me and said, "Did you know Bud Day? Are you on the way to the funeral? Are you from the funeral? Here's how he touched my life." And in the last leg of the journey, a young man across the aisle from me asked me if I was on my way back from the funeral. I said yes, and we talked a little bit. I don't know that he knew I'm a member of Congress. And I asked him what he did. He said, "Well, I'm an aviator." And a little bit later, he pulled up a picture of some of the pilots standing there together with Colonel Day in the middle. It was taken most recently, within the last couple of years. A great big beaming smile on the face of Bud Day, and those proud pilots all standing in a row. And we exchanged cards as we stepped off the plane. And I put it in my pocket, my front pocket, so I would look at it later, because without my glasses, it's better to shake hands and smile and read it later. When I got home last night, I pulled it out. This man is a Blue Angels pilot, proud and honored to have his picture taken with Colonel Bud Day. And I'm proud and honored to have had the privilege of knowing him, admiring him, stepping up to work to do some to honor him. And the honor that they gave him yesterday, as we went on a 48.1-mile processional from the funeral service to the cemetery in Pensacola, and every mile had mourners standing out there, and for the first 15 or so miles it was almost shoulder to shoulder. I have never, Mr. Speaker, seen so many flags and umbrellas in the same place in my life, and you would see families, full families, standing there holding flags, waving them, hands over their hearts. You might see someone in shorts and a T-shirt standing at full salute as the processional went by, hundreds of cars on the way to the cemetery. And when we entered the cemetery, there stood airmen in full salute for the first leg down through the cemetery, perhaps a half a mile of airmen stretched out. And that's something that grabs your heart. And when we turned the corner, and then it was Marines in full dress, full salute, all the way down to the burial ceremony. It was something that puts your heart up in your throat and moved people to tears and to emotions that they had not seen all day, by that great, great level of love and appreciation and respect for America up till the moment of his death, America's greatest living hero, Colonel Bud Day. And now, as I've said, I've had the privilege to walk the Iowa and South Dakota, but the Iowa cornfields with Bud Day, and to hunt and to shoot and to stop and rest and talk philosophy and history and politics and what we need to do. I want to put into the record, Mr. Speaker, that the rallies that we did here to battle Obamacare were inspired by Bud Day on top of one of the bluffs up in Plymouth County, Iowa, where he said, call everybody into the Capitol, surround the place, jam the place, don't let anybody in, don't let anybody out. You just get so many people there that say, keep your hands off my health care, they'll have to give up. That was Bud Day. That brought tens of thousands of people here. But in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I want to put John McCain's description of heaven into the record, because I see it the same way. I'm glad he said it. I'm glad he wrote it. He said, speaking of Bud Day, Colonel Bud Day, but he's gone now to a heaven I expect he imagined would look like an Iowa cornfield in early winter, filled with pheasants. This, Mr. Speaker, is a shot, I believe, of the last hunt in Iowa as Colonel Bud Day walked off the field, taken by my youngest son, Jeff, who did so because he wanted to commemorate that moment, fearing that it might be the last time. And so, as I look at this picture of Colonel Bud Day, America's greatest hero, Medal of Honor recipient, 70-some other medals, every combat medal available to him in 3 wars, serving our country, giving us TRICARE, giving us inspiration to battle Obamacare, with a smile on his face and a glint in his eye and a sense of humor and a way to express that extraordinary life that he lived. John McCain said, as I do, I will hunt the field with him again. God bless his life. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back.